I have two readings. The first is by Pir, who was a wonderful being and who was my teacher in Sufism for 25 years. And he was a real spiritual pioneer. Bearing in mind that the human condition is just a developmental stage in the evolutionary march, can you sense in yourself a longing to awaken beyond the human condition? Can you feel the evolutionary drive spurring you on? Can you see that if the initial springhead behind the whole evolutionary drive is the very freedom that resonates with your pristine celestial nature, then the cosmos envisioned as one being, which is what is meant by God, tends to converge in each being. This is incidentally the holistic model. If this is so, then the more we converge of the bounty of the universe, the more self-sufficient we become. Think of yourself as aiming at becoming gradually a spin-off in which the universe rethinks and reconstructs itself. And the second reading is from Rosemary Fillmore Rhea. The world we are experiencing today is the result of our collective consciousness. And if we want a new world, each of us must start taking responsibility for helping create it. So my sermon today is on what I call evolutionary spirituality. So we come into this life and we go through various stages of awakening. First, we discover ourselves as a separate being. We learn to relate to our environment. And then there's a natural evolution in our cognitive functioning, personality, moral development, and values. And some of you are familiar with Maslow, who described the hierarchy of needs. First, biological and physiological needs, safety needs, belongingness and love needs, esteem needs. And if all those are taken care of, only then can we hope to advance to self-actualization needs. So we progress through these naturally and satisfy the hierarchy of human needs, but our sense of our spiritual path may have a tendency to just be kind of static rather than also going through an evolutionary process. So here's a quote from Andrew Cohen. "Those of us who have transcended mythical belief systems know without any doubt that there is no God up in the sky. But when we awaken to what I call the evolutionary impulse, the mysterious passion to evolve, to become, to develop on every level, we rediscover who God is." And Pir would talk about, instead of God, because he said that the word has had so many meanings and associations to it, he called it the universe with a capital U. So you may be familiar with Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he introduced the concept of a paradigm shift, in which one conceptual worldview is replaced by another. In other words, a change from one way of thinking to another, which is a revolution, a transformation, a metamorphosis. And in science, there was a major paradigm shift with the discovery of quantum mechanics. This required a drastic shift away from the previous model of the Newtonian clockwork universe. Certainties were replaced with probabilities. Time became no longer viewed as linear and one-directional from past to present and future. In physics, a phenomenon known as retrocausality has been demonstrated, where the present can actually influence something that's already taken place, which is mind-boggling because our perspective is locked into a certain way of viewing things. Non-local effects have been demonstrated, which are instantaneous, and Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, but whether he liked it or not, it's a reality. Many physicists now believe more fundamental than energy or matter is consciousness. And even more remarkable, there's now conclusive evidence of the effects of subtle energy on what we could call ordinary reality, in which effects take place which should not be possible by the assumed immutable laws of physics, such as the second law of thermodynamics, which says entropy or disorder is always increasing. So while this revolution in scientific understanding has been ongoing, basic tenets of religion based on a Newtonian universe remain at the core of mainstream religion, in which there is a dualistic notion of God, in which God is described as omniscient and omnipotent. And the aim of religion and most spiritual traditions is to go beyond physical manifestation, which is viewed as either being an illusion or having fallen from a previous state of perfection. And the goal is to get to someplace better, in terms in different traditions: moksha, mukti, liberation, salvation, and in some systems transcending any sense of personal identity and merging into an infinite state of non-duality. And this is, I would say, the majority of mystical spirituality. This is the aim, a non-dualistic state. And Sufism, at least, has a different take on this. And the aim in Sufism is awakening in life. And what does that mean? Well, hopefully we're all awake here. I see most of you have your eyes open. Awakening in life means bringing through our higher potentialities into manifestation. So spirituality is often thought of as being an individual process of transformation. And the thought is, well, I'm changing from an individual in a state of limitation to a higher state of being. Something's going to be done to me by some great being or practices or whatever, and help me arrive at something over here. And it's a very different way of thinking to consider that what's really going on is a participation in our unique way of relationship with everything that there is. So it's really the whole totality is evolving, and we have a part to play in our plug-in for that. And I'll have more to say about that in a little bit. So Ibn Arabi, who's one of my favorite Sufi mystics, he lived hundreds of years ago, said that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that can never be known by anyone else. So what's revealed by the awakening of one person is something that could not come through from anybody else. Buddha or Christ, there's something that can only come through us, and it helps to serve to further the evolution of the awakening taking place on every level of existence. So now let's segue into science. You may think, well, that sounds interesting, mysticism stuff. But science more and more has realized and discovered that everything in the universe is truly interconnected with everything else at a fundamental level beyond manifestation. And there's different terms: a zero-point field, the quantum vacuum. This is the same idea that mystics have arrived at over thousands of years, just with different terminology. So in Sufism, it's sometimes called the place that is no place, or Nakoj al-Bad is the term. Science has also discovered that there's a self-organizing principle that's inherent in life and even in what we think of as inorganic systems. So I only have time to just put the briefest mention on things like chaos theory, which describes how a system undergoes a transformation from a fairly stable state to an in-between state. And in the in-between state, it's impossible to know what the outcome is going to be, but then it arrives at a higher state. So Sufism talks about this. They talk about going from a station, they have a term called maqam, undergoing a process of dissolution, but doesn't mean destruction. It means just a releasing of the former vantage point and perspective and emerging to a higher state of being, which is called baqa. So here's a quote from Henry Miller. "The moment one gives close attention to anything, even a blade of grass, it becomes a mysterious, awesome, indescribably magnificent world in itself." So a little more into science here. Physicists now are talking about, depending on which string theory you like, there's either 10 dimensions, or if that's not enough for you, there's 21 dimensions. And we have enough trouble with 3 of space and 1 of time, but there's all these other ones here. So spiritual awakening in different traditions in mysticism is described as a process of awakening to a higher, you could say, dimensionality of ourself, in which it's not that we're here and we're somehow catapulting our consciousness up to here, which is what it seems like from our usual frame of reference, but actually it's becoming aware of other levels of existence on which we already exist, but they're latent or dormant. And the physicists in these 10 or 21 dimensions, when asked, well, where are these other dimensions? They say they're curled up from our vantage point to they're so small we can't perceive them, but they nevertheless do exist. So some very respected physicists have described physical manifestation as being a simulation so that we can eventually learn to function in higher levels of reality. And I've come across articles in Scientific American that if you didn't know they were Scientific American, you might think, well, maybe this is the National Enquirer. So one article said our sense of time is an illusion created by a false identification with a limited cross-section of a higher reality. And these are hard scientists saying that what we perceive as normal reality is really a holographic projection of a higher order of reality. Well, the mystics are basically saying the same thing. They have different terms and different systems. And so you probably think that the only choices on your menu are to be in a dualistic state of consciousness, which is the typical waking state of consciousness for most people, in which we feel ourselves as separated from whatever it is we're experiencing. And that dualistic state is not just with what's external to us. We may have a dualistic experience of what we experience in our inner realm because we think of ourselves as, I am the experiencer having this experience with fill in the blank. So this mystical experience, well, I'm here, my usual state, but somehow I'm experiencing something up here and we perceive it as separate from what our true identity really is. Okay. If you think that this is not so great, I want to get more than just dualism, you may think, well, what's the antidote? And the usual antidote that's offered on the menu of many systems is total unitive, non-dualistic consciousness. That's a mouthful, but it basically means a dissolution of any sense of personal identity and merging into and fill in the blank. In yoga, there's a term nirvikalpa samadhi, which means without seed, so there's no longer any bit of what we think of as ourselves, but somehow we're merged in this infinite ocean of bliss forever. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, but here we are, and we're thinking, well, there must be some reason why there's this world, and we'd like to somehow make it a better world. So we think of what we can do to bring that about. But as long as we're in a dualistic state of consciousness, there's a limitation on what's possible that we can do. And when we can get to a different modality of experience, which the term I have for it is called relational unity. It's a state of being in which your sense of yourself is fully preserved, but it's no longer bounded by rigid barriers and boundaries. It's no longer limited to a modality of perception in which you feel separated from what you're experiencing. And now you become capable of having an experience that's very permeable and a lot of circulation going on with this. And we've all have had experiences of this. And one very common example is if you're having a wonderful conversation with a dear friend. And at first it's like, well, what have you been up to lately? And it's just kind of chit-chat. But as you get into it, after a while, each of you finds yourself thinking of things and saying things that you never would have thought of on your own. And the Sufis talk about this as a third presence arises by this commingling of the presence of the two beings and sprinkling in a little bit of Ibn Arabi, the unique wisdom that's available in each being is now available to the other, and something now is possible that couldn't have happened separately. And this is just with two people coming to this state. So imagine if you have a group of like-minded people with a similar intention to bring about change in the world. Think about the possibilities of now what can happen, and even insights and ideas that would have never come from any of the separated individuals, no matter how well intended. And this is probably a different way of thinking about things, but it's very much a reality. If I had hours and hours, I would share some things with you, but I'll just make a brief mention of Roger Nelson, who did research with random number generators. And not very interesting. They would just generate random numbers, but he made these little devices and put them at different places around the world. And they just collect data all the time. But he found that before and during significant events in which everybody's tuned into the same thing, could be the Oscars, the Super Bowl, these random number generators deviated significantly from randomness. Something about the collective consciousness was having an effect on these. He also found, he looked at the data 6 hours before 9/11, and the random number generators went crazy. And so in Star Wars, you could say there was a disturbance in the force, but there was something, these things were recorded, this retrocausality effect I talked about, that from our vantage point was traveling backwards in time, But in the deeper reality, it's all just there, what's happening. Okay. In a similar way, you can have an experience of relational unity with, quote, higher parts of yourself. You can have an experience from both sides of your being so that the experience is one in which what we might call the signature of your soul, the uniqueness of you, is resounding throughout the entire experience. Even if you get into very subtle states beyond form, your sense of self is preserved. This is not the usual sense of yourself as being limited to your physical form or your usual personality, but rather a sense of your deep core essence of who your being is that can never be lost. The mystics talk about an alchemical process, which is not the exoteric part is like turning lead to gold, but the esoteric part is a transformation of your true being, and it's described as becoming adamant. Something is becoming form that is never lost, and it does not mean that it's rigid. This is a state in which your soul has become tempered no matter what experience you're having, and you can never lose that sense of yourself. So here's a quote by Karen Bishop. When we feel passion for something, it's because we're remembering what it was we came here to do. The more passion we feel, the more in alignment with Source, capital S, we are, allowing this energy to pour through us with no hesitation. This is the way it was meant to be. So in Buddhism, there's this wonderful principle called mutually dependent co-arising. This means that one thing does not cause another, but that both cause each other simultaneously. We're not used to thinking this way, but physicists are talking like this too. One is not pre the other. You tend to think of things sequentially, such as initially there was not a universe. God created it. The Big Bang created it. It evolved to a certain point. Another way to look at things is if at the instant there was any form of manifestation, there was a relationship between the two sides, the manifest and the transcendent. Ibn Arabi, the Sufi mystic I talked about, describes there being a new creation arising in every instant. Incidentally, the physicists are saying the same thing. Time is not continuous. It's little tiny intervals bounded by what's called the Planck unit of time, and there's this one, then there's that one. But just like when we watch a movie, which is a bunch of frames projected at 60 or more frames per second, it looks continuous. It's really just one frame and the next frame and the next frame. William Tiller, who is a professor emeritus from Stanford, has demonstrated that when there's a linkage between subtle energy and ordinary reality, that entropy decreases. There's more order. Whenever we bring this type of connection ourselves, whether it's through meditation or other spiritual practices, or through fulfilling our creative passion in life, which could come through our work, art, music, poetry, dance, or deeply relating to nature or to other people, through any of these, presence deepens. We feel more alive, but we're also helping to bring through that aspect of wisdom that can only come through us. As my former teacher, Pir Balayat in the Sufis stated, we become capable of participating in the divine programming. Seth Lloyd, who's a computer scientist at MIT, has described the universe as a giant quantum computer. When asked what it was computing, he answered, itself. The Sufis say creation began because God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known. This is a mystical way of describing the same thing that Seth Lloyd has stated. Wisdom comes through the continuous relationship between the manifest and the transcendent as we fulfill our purpose by becoming more and more capable of awakening to ourselves as multidimensional beings. This is a reality. It sounds like, oh, it's science fiction or that's mystical, who knows what, but people in science as well as people that are really exploring spirituality in a new light are arriving at the same conclusion. We awaken to ourselves as multidimensional beings who live in a reality immeasurably richer than the one we thought we lived in when we were limited by our dualistic ways of thinking and perceiving. When each of us unfolds our unique spiritual wisdom through a never-ending process of awakening, our spirituality becomes service to humanity and to the universe. Our personal evolution enables us to be capable of participating in the evolution of the cosmos in which we are deeply interconnected. I believe this is the true meaning of the term dharma, which means our true duty and purpose in life. Spirituality is then evolutionary. It's not only about restoration or redemption, but about transformation and unfoldment. There are tools for working with consciousness available from many different spiritual traditions that don't require any particular belief system to work with them. Each of us can contribute to bringing more life and expanded possibilities to the world we live in by learning to awaken to our possibilities. Spirituality is more than just acquiring wisdom and experiences of great beings of the past. If spirituality is living, then transmissions from all who are a part of a particular tradition are enhanced by our own awakened realizations. This is the ultimate ennobling of each soul, to know that there is something priceless that can only emerge through us. There is no fixed body of revelation or wisdom, no predetermined blueprints of the transcendent or divine. So I'll repeat again what Byron Bellizzo said. The path of cosmic spirituality is the great quest to evolve an immortal soul that is rich in quality and broad in extent because of our life experiences. But the journey also contributes at each step to the evolution of all other selves and souls here and throughout the universe and into an endless future.